Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and this is the Right to Read initiative, where we speak about best practices for teaching reading. Today, I have the pleasure of Sara joining me from Alberta, and we are talking about a psychologist's perspective on assessment and identification. Now, at the end of February, the Ontario Human Rights Commission released the Right to Read public inquiry report, and it contained 157 recommendations. Now, several of those recommendations are specifically designed to try and help the students that are at risk for reading failure. So our conversation today is going to be focusing on looking at assessments and identification of students who are at risk. And then next Friday, Sarah's going to give us her perspective on reading instruction, because we can definitely use those assessments to inform our reading instruction. So thank you for joining me today, Sara. Why don't you give listeners a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thanks so much. And thank you very much for having me today, Kathryn. I really appreciate being invited. As Kathryn said, my name is Sara Peden, and I'm a psychologist, a registered psychologist in the province of Alberta. When I first started my career, like a long time ago, in the early 90s, I worked for a company that provided consulting services all over the north and central part of Alberta. And so I did a lot of assessment in schools all over the province, trying to help teachers to understand what a psychologist's perspective around learning and development could bring to, the individualizing or personalizing programming for that student. And then after a number of years of that, I was happy to move away from quite as much travel as that job required. And I moved down to Calgary and worked for a major school board here, the biggest public school board in Alberta, and worked there for almost 20 years in starting out in assessment and consultation kind of role, and then moving into some more system development. I did a lot of work with professional learning for teachers and sort of policy kinds of things. So the kinds of recommendations that we see in the report around policy for assessment and identification, as well as the specifics recommended, are topics that are really near and dear to my heart. In the last 5 years or so, I've been doing a lot of I'm in private practice at the moment, and I do some assessment, lots of consultation, provide professional learning opportunities for schools when they ask. And a lot of what I do now is actually some direct intervention with students, because that's just the most fun to actually teach kids to read. There is nothing better than teaching kids to read. And my expertise in reading assessment and psychoeducational assessment, I think, really serves me well to do that intervention work. I'm also a registered teacher, a member of the Ontario College of Teachers.
That's awesome. And like you, I love doing that intervention piece. And I find looking at the reports so informative to help us really understand what the students need and how we can best meet their needs.
Mm-hmm. I think a well-written psych report should do that, a psychoeducational report. And just for, I'm not sure, I think we probably have a fairly wide-ranging audience here. So would it be okay if I just sort of describe what I mean when I say a psychoeducational assessment?
I love that.
Okay, so you'll see both terms of psychological assessment and sometimes psychoeducational assessment. Sometimes we use them a bit interchangeably, so I just want to be precise. I think of a psychological assessment as an assessment that may investigate and assess all kinds of aspects of psychological functioning. It could be about emotional functioning. It could be about behavior, could be about personality. In the adult world, there's often some forensic kinds of psychological assessments or child custody kinds of assessments done by psychologists. So a psychoeducational assessment is a very narrow subset of psychological assessment. And usually what that incorporates is some assessment of thinking and learning capacities, the kinds of generic skills that we think of, language development and reasoning with language, visual problem solving, sometimes what we call fluid reasoning, or the ability to think of things in different ways and from different perspectives. A typical psychoeducational assessment will include an IQ test, which is an intelligence quotient, but that's just made up of some language, some visual processing. Working memory is a big part of that, language comprehension, and so on. With a psychoeducational assessment, though, we also want to see the actual academic skills that a student has. So how much have they already learned in terms of their reading? How much have they learned about writing? How much have they learned about math? So we have some of the things that tell us their learning profile, the kinds of strengths and weaknesses they have as learners. And then we also have what have they already learned. And from all that kind of information put together, a psychologist can help a teacher to understand how this child learns, the kinds of things that will be most helpful for this child in all likelihood, and so on. And I always say that a good psychoeducational assessment it does its best work when somebody has really framed the referral in terms of questions. What is it that we feel like we don't know about this child and that we need to know in order to do better programming? Sometimes it says like, where does this child's skills fall compared to other children in academics? Or, why is it that they seem to be having, good success in some areas and not so good success in other areas? So I always spend quite a bit of time before I do an assessment trying to pin down, why are we doing this? What is our purpose? And how do we frame that in terms of some questions that we have?
Definitely. And, I think, unfortunately, where things currently are with psychoeducational assessments, it's one thing that in the teacher education programs, I feel they don't spend enough time on, and teachers feel intimidated by them and don't understand how to go through that document to get the best information about how they can help their students reach their peers and catch up. So in the report, there is a lot of recommendations that look at, assessment and identifying risk for reading. So one thing I think that's important to mention is right now, a lot of the schools are using that quote unquote wait to fail model. And what that means is that they're waiting until the students are really struggling. They're not looking at the kids that may, struggle in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2. They're waiting until grade 3 or the end of grade 2 to get the identification done. The huge problem with that is the most effective intervention window happens before then. Also, the amount of damage it does to the child falling behind their peers and wondering why everybody else is getting it so easily and they can't.
Yes.
They come to the conclusion that they're stupid and it's their fault and they might as well give up. It's a very difficult thing to go through as a child.
Yes.
And it's a very difficult thing to see happen as a parent. And what the Right to Read initiative is trying to move from this wait to fail model to a catch them before they fall model.
Yes. That
will save hundreds of millions of dollars.
It will. In the long term, this is going to, to the extent that these recommendations get implemented, I think there's a wonderful set of recommendations here. When I look at them, I know the degree to which it's a huge project to be thinking about how all of those recommendations can be well implemented. So I don't by any means want to make it sound like, oh, it's just easy. We're just going to implement these recommendations and everything will be fine. There's a journey that we're going to need to go through to get there. But to the extent that they're implemented, they will, in fact, I believe, save a lot of money, both within the education system and then later on with respect to social kinds of costs, because, people know that illiteracy, regardless of what its cause is in any particular individual, creates just huge costs, not only for that individual and their family, but social costs as well. Unemployment and underemployment, health costs that are higher for people who don't have strong literacy skills. What sometimes we refer to the school to prison pipeline, because often kids have been so frustrated and so let down in our school systems that they end up being resistant towards school and those kinds of things. That's not exactly what we're here to talk about, but I want to frame it in those that you're exactly right, that if we can create strong foundational literacy skills, especially, my passion is particularly for the K-2 time period, because that's the time that we can get to the foundational skills that provide kids a good platform for the rest of their years. So yes, I completely agree with you about saving in the long run.
Well, and I think one of the first steps that we need to do system-wide is working on professional development and learning across various professions and levels within the school, because we need to learn how to identify those students early. Now, luckily, there's been plenty of research in this that is very effective at showing that we can, with fairly good certainty, help these kids. And it's important to recognize that when we're doing any sort of early identification, it's considered a screening process. It is not diagnostic. So when we're looking at kids, you can do it as young as preschoolers to say, this child is showing signs of being at risk for reading failure. Now, we're not giving them any labels.
That's right. There's no diagnosis involved. It's a question of, are there characteristics that we can see relatively early on in the developmental stages of, at the preschool level, primarily language and speech sound development. We hear the language that a typical toddler uses, a typical preschooler uses, and sometimes we can notice real differences as early as that. Now, some obviously language does develop over time, and we don't want to say that, like, let's say you have a trouble sequencing sounds. That some of those sequencing difficulties are really normal in a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old. I'm sure all of us have heard a child at some point refer to their biscotti, their biscotti and sauce, or because spaghetti is a hard word to say.
Yeah, and understanding where it's appropriate and where it should cause concern.
Exactly. And that's where the professional learning that you talk about is, I think, so important. And it's not only for teachers. I know from the work that I've done over the years that different psychologists have varying levels of expertise in the reading acquisition and literacy acquisition. Some psychologists specialize more in students with different needs and characteristics. I know I have colleagues who specialize in the autism spectrum, and that's sort of the nature of their work more than just sort of the literacy work. My work is highly specialized into the literacy realm, but I don't do a lot of, emotional assessment. I certainly evaluate that in context of a learning issue. But if it gets into this is clearly an emotional thing more than it's a learning thing, there may be better psychologists for that than I am. So psychologists and teachers, we all need to be developing more and more expertise. Learning from speech and language colleagues teach us so much. And I like to think that it works both ways. And that collaborative aspect is really important with assessment and identification. The more information I can get from the family, from the teacher, from the speech and language, if there's a speech and language pathologist has been involved, the more collaboration we have, the better job we can all do together to support the child, I think.
Definitely.
But in terms of that, I just wanted to say, I think the number one most important recommendation, and if I had to pick one thing from this report, and I really don't want to pick one thing, but if I did have to pick one recommendation, I would pick the recommendation that says you may not use psychoeducational assessment as an eligibility criteria for intervention. We do not need a psychological or psychoeducational assessment in order to start reading intervention or literacy intervention. We know how children learn to read, and regardless of what their difficulties are, where the struggles are coming from in their reading, we know what to do about it. We know the areas of reading skill that we can look at. We can look at the child's phonemic awareness. You don't need a psychological assessment to look at phonemic awareness. You don't need a psychological assessment to teach phonics. There's lots of things we can do to evaluate if fluency is coming along at a developmentally expected. When I say developmentally, I just mean an age progression. Most kids get a little more fluent in their reading as they get older. And we know about, we can measure language skills and such, either in informal ways or with some classroom suitable assessments. So that's the number one thing that I'm very excited about. I think if Ontario can move towards saying, we don't give kids reading intervention because they've had a psych assessment and a psychologist says so. We give kids reading intervention when they're struggling with reading. That's just going to set the precedent that we all across Canada, I think, that we all would like to see, or many of us would like to see.
Well, and I think the important thing to bring up, and that some people may not realize, is how long the wait list can be to get a psychoeducational assessment. There are schools that will say, you know what, if you can afford it, go out and do it on your own, because it's going to be years. Now, schools typically only get 2 or 3, sometimes 4, depending on the population of the school, in a year for the entire school. So if your child is not causing them a lot of grief,
and that's, I completely agree that is the case and I want to acknowledge that because education is something that is, legislated and administered at a provincial level, there can be differences across provinces, but certainly, and the 2 provinces I know best are Ontario and Alberta. And, I don't think you'll disagree with me from BC either, that, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Where were we going there with the,
well, how long it takes.
How long it takes. Thank you. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought there for a second. That it's no matter which province you're in, as far as I'm aware, there's never enough resources. Now, one of the things that I would say about there not being enough resources is because there's an awful lot of demand for the resource of a psychologist to do an assessment, because it's being used as a gatekeeper for intervention services. So one of the things that I would really like to see happen is that as we get more professional learning for teachers and other psychologists as well, and that isn't being used as a criteria for getting intervention, then we'll see some less necessity for psychological assessments at the earliest stages, because we will have teachers saying, I don't need a psychoeducational assessment. I can look at the child's phonemic awareness. I can look at how they're doing with learning the phonics, both the letter sound knowledge and the skills of blending sounds together and listening and segmenting sounds, pulling them apart to be able to help spell words. When teachers can do more of that, and school systems are set up so that if you have a child that's obviously showing difficulties with early literacy compared to other kids the same age as them, and let's go ahead and set them up for intervention. Let's get that earlier intervention. And oftentimes we can actually catch those children up. And now's the time that it's so much easier to get a child catching up in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, than after that age. So I think we may see a reduction initially. And then what we'll see, I think, is psychological assessments being done. Yes, more for those students with the more complex needs. For example, when autism spectrum disorders are overlapping with reading skills, when emotional behavioral concerns are bigger than the academics. Having said that, though, let me just interrupt myself, I guess, to say I worked in a school system once where we really noticed that as we did less and less learning, like psychoeducational assessments, because children were struggling academically, we may have, we ended up identifying less kids because we were doing less formal assessment. But the number of children with behavior and emotional problems was growing, because if we don't catch these children early on, they show their distress in other ways. They don't stand up and politely say to the teacher, I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty reading this, and it would really help me if you could do some accommodations. Rather, what they do is they lash out in frustration, or they're crying and under their desk and those kinds of things. So I think that we'll see, we're not creating emotional and behavioral issues by frustrating children with the academics. And that will reduce some forms of psychological assessment, meaning the psychologist will just be involved at the places where their expertise is exceptionally required, in the autism spectrum, in the intellectual disabilities, in the, there's a range of behavioral and emotional kinds of things that can impact children. So I hope that psychological services will be used even better, not that they will be not needed at all.
Mm-hmm. And the other important, like we talked about the wait in schools, but when you go private, there is just as big as a demand, and there are wait lists. And if you are not in a metropolitan center, there's the cost of traveling to the school psychologist and the availability in getting the time off. The current model isn't working. Yeah. And that's why these recommendations are so important, because they lead us toward a better model where more of our students are getting serviced. Now, when we do that identification and intervention in those early years, the number of students that need a psychoeducational assessment greatly reduces.
Exactly. I think that's exactly true. And that number, you're right. I mean, I do assessment in my private practice, and I couldn't possibly keep up with the, like it says on my website right now, I can't take any new referrals because I'm, booked into the future kind of. And that's because we're not really getting enough of it done in school. But that's because for a long time, there have been issues with teachers being trained in ways to teach reading that actually don't match really well with how children acquire reading. So I know we're going to talk about more about that next week, but certainly what I wanted to kind of, emphasize for today is the assessment recommendations basically say, you can get a psychoeducational assessment once you're into the tier 3 level. In other words, we have a tiered system of intervention. Any child who's struggling at the classroom level should be able to have in-class help from their teacher or intervention. And then tier 2 is often done at small group level. A school system or a school would be organized. Maybe they have a learning resource teacher, or they have somebody with a different title, but who provides some small group reading intervention. And then if that's not working, we go up to that tier 3, maybe some individualized or very intensive intervention. And it used to be that you sort of had to get a psych assessment to get that level. And now I love the recommendation that's very clear that you may want a psychoeducational assessment at tier 3, but you don't wait to do that level of intervention until you have that. you do the intervention based on the child's reading profile and their reading needs. And then, yes, if you think there's some complicating factors or some things that are really puzzling you about why the child isn't making better progress or faster progress, then yes, bring in the assessment. And remembering that there's multiple purposes. And sometimes it's been confusing for people, and I think it may still be, that assessment for eligibility purposes and assessment for a diagnosis are not exactly the same thing, although they're often used sort of interchangeably, depending on this province, depending on the school jurisdiction, sometimes even depending on the school itself. So I think it's probably helpful for people if we recognize that an assessment that reaches a diagnosis for a child that makes them, that identifies if they have a specific learning disorder, that can make them eligible for certain accommodations on the long term. They may be diagnosed with having a particular, falling under the category of learning disability. That means that they're protected under the rights for people with disabilities and such. But all of that is not, you don't have to have a diagnosis for eligibility. Eligibility for programming is depending on what governments and school systems and in districts and individual schools say is the eligibility. Any school could say, we're going to arrange our budget. If I shouldn't say any school, schools with control over their individual budgets can say, well, we're going to have an individual reading specialist that's going to provide one-to-one intervention for our most needy children. But they might be often having to make really difficult decisions about what they're not going to have in their school as a result. And those are hard decisions. Mm-hmm. In my personal opinion, reading should always come first. I think we should teach every kid to read before we do much of anything else. But now you get into some values and politics and such in that.
Well, one thing I wanted to also bring up is how we got into this wait to fail model in the first place. And that has to do with a couple things. One is the misnomer, or that a lot of parents are told, they're a boy, they'll catch up, they're further behind girls, or they're a late baby. They'll have all these excuses for why the child isn't at the same rate of their peers. Now, the other reason is because an older definition of a learning disability had a deficit model. So they had to be a certain amount behind their peers in order to get the diagnosis. Now, to do that, that typically took until grade 3 to see that large deficit. Now, we've moved away from that definition for
psychologists have,
yes,
in terms of their and again, recognizing that not all psychologists have the same knowledge and the same, but those who are working to diagnose with the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that's the book that we turn to look at all the criteria for different diagnoses. Same way your doctor might look up, how do I know if it's this disorder, this disease, or this other one? They can check the criteria and say, it's clearly more this, or it's clearly more that. Well, we have, as psychologists, we have diagnostic manuals that help us to distinguish between things. And so if you're using the DSM-5, then you have some definitions now of a specific learning disorder in reading, for example, that does not look at that, as though there's like an intellectual ability and then a reading ability. And if they're far apart, then that means you've got a learning disorder. Or it doesn't mean like, here's your grade level and here's where you're reading, and that it's that gap that matters. Now, what we understand is that basically, if you're really struggling with reading and there's no better explanation, and we can see that it's due to some of the processing kinds of things that lead to reading difficulties, then we know right away that this is a learning issue. It's not something we need to wait to. And I think some of that wait to fail model, to be fair, certainly as it didn't come from teachers originally. Okay, that I don't think any teacher wants to see a child have to fail for 2 or 3 years before they can get assistance or help. But it came from some, us not having the strongest understanding of how reading is acquired and those models that you're talking about. But I'd like to add one aspect of what really got in the way there, or created those problems. In about the late 70s and early 80s, there became a movement for teaching that was referred to as the whole language approach to reading or writing. And it was based on a belief system or a philosophy that understood reading and literacy as something that is acquired very similarly, following the same kind of developmental pathways as oral language. Mm-hmm. We actually now know that isn't true. So the same way that, when if you're a parent and your child isn't babbling by 8 months old or speaking in single words by 14 or whatever, that I don't have all the charts memorized, but, they're not speaking in sentences as a 2-year-old or coming close to 3, then you start saying, well, is it typical development? Is there something? And sometimes it is wise to say, no, look, these skills do develop, they unfold quite naturally. Make sure that you continue talking to your child, lots of verbal interaction, and there's a range that's normal for oral language development, and it does develop fairly naturally because our brains have been evolved for hundreds of thousands of years to develop oral language. The theory of whole language was that reading and literacy worked the same way, and that if you just waited and gave kids enough time, they would acquire the skill of reading, because all you really need to learn to read is to be exposed to reading, and just a little bit of instruction in sound symbols should get you off and running. And so the theory itself said, if a child isn't reading early on, keep exposing them, keep reading to them, make sure they love reading, surround them with books, and they will come to read. Well, we actually now know the part of the brain that we use to develop the foundational reading skills of being able to lift the words off the page, tell what it is that the words say, that is a part of the brain that is naturally wired to recognize faces and objects, but it's not naturally wired to read. So the process of instruction and learning to read kind of rewires that part of the brain and specializes it for literacy. But that takes active instruction for many, many, many kids. Some kids appear to just learn to read as though it was nothing, as though they were naturally wired for it. They just happen to be kids who can easily infer the code. In other words, they can hear the sounds, look at the letters, and they can figure out the connections between sounds and letters and develop phonics almost on their own without even realizing that's what they're doing. So yes, it appears that some kids learn to read without phonics or without instruction. But if we understand what's really going on, the brain is being changed, adapted, modified to learn to read. So I do want to say that those old wait to fail models weren't teachers' faults. They were the theory that they were being told. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, we have lots of teachers now that were so entrenched in that model that they were told this is how kids learn to read, that now we're having to do a lot of work to bring people up to the more up-to-date understanding of how kids actually learn to read.
Definitely. And it takes time and open-mindedness. And hopefully we're at a point where it's a little bit easier to make that jump, just because we do have the evidence in science and with the brain scans showing how reading develops. And there are those students that need the explicit instruction to make the most efficient pathways for reading, as opposed to, there are other areas that can be used to read, but they're not as efficient and not as effective.
Mm-hmm. And well, and if we think about memorizing words, sorry, Kathryn, I didn't mean to interrupt. If we think about, you go ahead.
I was just saying that, or meaning that we need to make sure that we're making sure all students establish the most effective way for reading. So you're not having kids run a marathon when they only need to take 10 steps.
Exactly. I think, it is not impossible to memorize the appearance of a number of words. Okay, this is what we would refer to as sort of the, like, look at a word and say what it is because somebody told you, and then repeat that. You can actually learn some words that way. Okay. It is an okay method for some of the words that are hard to teach at the beginning of teaching phonics because they're using more advanced phonic patterns. Okay. So there are some words we ask children to kind of learn by looking at them. Even then, there's better ways to do it than just like, flashcards and straight memory. But if that's the only way that you learn to read, your reading is never going to be very efficient. And, we have to link sound and print and the correct parts of the print to the correct parts of the sounds of words. We have to link the spelling of a sound to the sound itself, not just at the single letter level, but we got lots of places where 2 letters are used to represent one word and so on. So, I think that the more that psychologists and the more that teachers are working to understand the actual acquisition of reading, the closer they will all be in terms of what they would recommend, because, we'll be evidence-based and science-based.
Well, you highlighted a bunch of the different recommendations for us to kind of briefly talk about. And I definitely want to address some of them because I think it's going to help listeners understand what exactly this report is saying to help our students. Now, I think we'll start off with number 71 because we've already discussed that one, generally speaking. So this recommendation, there's 2 of them that have to do with developing eligibility criteria. And it's talking about how the Minister of Education needs to be working with the external experts to mandate and standardize evidence-based eligibility criteria to receive reading interventions. And this is meaning that they're going to set out recommendations for the grade levels for these interventions and for them to outline clear and appropriate decision-making rules for selecting evidence-based programs and matching students to intervention programs. This is extremely important, and to me, is one that is essential for being in there because it highlights a couple different things.
Yes.
One of them is it shouldn't depend on which school you're in as to whether you meet the eligibility criteria to get support. Every student in every city, town, hamlet, location in Canada, in North America, around the world, deserves the ability to be taught how to read. And if they need help, they deserve to get the help. The other thing that I think is important that it highlights is that looking at matching the student with the appropriate intervention. It can be very damaging for a student who is told that, oh, you know what, we're going to do this big fancy program and it's going to work. You're going to do awesome. You're going to learn how to read. And then they go through the program and it doesn't work. And it turns out that they were working on the wrong skill in the program.
Exactly.
And this happens all the time, unfortunately. And it's a waste of everybody's time and frustrating for everyone in the process.
Right. And I think that many psychologists are really well placed to help avoid that if we can kind of dig down with teachers into what we know about how reading is acquired. And, it's actually not, it's complex, but it's not outside of the realm of understanding. We can dig down. Many of you in our listening audience may be familiar with some of the sort of the theories of reading acquisition. And one of the ones I like to go to a lot is like Hollis Scarborough was a researcher who created kind of a visual, like an infographic, sort of showing how reading develops. And it's a beautiful metaphor of like strands of thread, really, that get woven together. There's a whole series of strands that have to do with pulling the words off the page, the decoding. And there's a whole bunch of strands that have to do with language comprehension, background knowledge, vocabulary, both expressive and receptive, that the words that you know when you hear them, the words that you can use to speak with, background knowledge, inferencing, the ideas of how language works in different social situations. All of that language stuff and all of the print stuff kind of has to weave together to create reading. So if we know that, and we know all these different pieces, we can actually assess each little piece separately. And then come to say, okay, there's no point in doing a fluency intervention with this child because they can't yet read the words accurately. Okay, this is one of the things that's sort of driving me a little crazy in some situations recently, is seeing people having goals for fluency when the child cannot read the words at high. I saw one like read fluently with 80% correct. And that's just a bad goal, because if you can't read more than 80% correct, you're not ready to work on fluency. So that was just an example I was thinking of, that an assessment of both the reading and the cognitive processes, working memory and processing speed, and the things that phonological processing, that's the processing of the sounds of language. That kind of assessment can really help target what kind of intervention is needed. And until teachers feel really comfortable doing that themselves, because they know so much about reading now, they will, if these recommendations are implemented, teachers will come to that knowledge. But until then, psychology can really help.
Yeah. And the other thing around that intervention piece is when we're looking at older students and, they're struggling to understand the text. So we need to do an intervention based on comprehension.
That's a classic.
But they're missing the decoding and the word recognition side of the piece. So no matter how much and how hard they try on that comprehension activity, if they can't read it effectively and fluently in a timely manner so they can actually remember what they're reading, it's not going to help them.
And I think that's a great example. It's a perfect example of sometimes how reading difficulties can be a little bit elusive, because they appear sometimes to be a little different than they actually are. So I can't tell you the number of times, and do not hear the teachers out there, do not hear this as a criticism. Okay. But it's hard to see sometimes on the surface where a child's reading difficulties actually lie. Can't tell you the number of times that a teacher said to me, oh, he can read, but he's having trouble with, understanding. Mm-hmm. And often these are like the older children, like you're saying. And the reason that the teacher understands that they can read is because the child reads during independent reading time. They appear to be reading like their peers. They can answer some literal questions because they've got the gist of it. Sometimes, and here's one that nobody will be surprised by, sometimes kids have a book that they're supposed to be reading and go home and watch the movie of that book. There's all kinds of reasons. It turns out that what I consider able to read is that, for me, that means they can decode with high accuracy. Mm-hmm. They're not struggling to tell me what the words on the page say. Mm-hmm. That's the first part of they can read. And then how does that interact with their language comprehension? And are they making that good sense out of what they read? Lots of times teachers know the kids aren't making that great sense out of what they read, but they don't often realize how serious the decoding problems are. And if we could solve this, is especially true when you have a child who, really interacts with you verbally, can tell you a story, can answer your questions and have a very normal, typical conversation about a topic of interest. And then they seem to be struggling with reading comprehension, and it doesn't seem to match their oral language. One of the first things we need to do is assess whether or not they actually have all the foundational decoding skills. And I'm often surprised by how well a teacher thinks a child can decode when they can't do that with me in an assessment. Mm-hmm. And it's not just, we always find ways to what we call triangulate the data, make sure that it wasn't they were having a bad day with me. Mm-hmm. When we really dig into it and look and do a intensive assessment, we can tell the difference. And a lot of the times there's real decoding problems.
Well, and as a dyslexic who's gone through this, I can tell you that it's typically fairly easy in a classroom to fudge your way through reading the book, because typically there's a lot of classroom discussion and you can pick up enough from that to make it look like you know what you're talking about, even though you may not have read all of it or just, a few pages, right? Because that's all that you could do. So,
and that's, I'm in some ways, don't forget, we're glad when good, rich classroom discussion is going on around grade level and, somewhat challenging reading material. We absolutely want that so that kids who do struggle with decoding are continue to grow in their vocabulary, their language development, the richness of their thinking in language. But what we can't do is believe that compensates for difficulties with decoding. Anita Archer is a researcher that's very famous in this area, and I won't be able to quote her directly, but it's actually a slogan I have on the back of a shirt that I wear. It says, "There is no comprehension strategy powerful enough to make up for the fact that you can't read the words."
Yeah.
Okay. And so again, it's diving from an assessment and identification perspective. We don't want to identify kids for eligibility for intervention. Mm-hmm. We do want to identify what aspects of reading they need intervention with and how they can best be helped by that intervention. And I really like the way that these recommendations are set out, recognizing that sort of triangle model that I mentioned earlier, about the tiers of intervention. And one of the important concepts is that response to intervention. If you have a child who isn't quite coming to reading in the early grades of kindergarten to grade 2, but you give them some small group instruction, and you get really explicit and systematic about exactly what they need to learn and know and be able to do in order to read and write. Mm-hmm. And then they kind of are caught up. That shows a good response to intervention. Not every child will respond as readily. And so when children aren't responding to one intervention, we need to be able to do that assessment to find out exactly what it is that they need in order to respond. And it's tricky stuff. I've seen some teachers and psychologists, like sometimes we really puzzle to know what to try next. And I guess I would like to bring up one point in that idea of response to intervention. I've seen a little too much of the assessment or what we call progress monitoring, as if what we're monitoring is the child's progress. And I mean, I get that we are in some way. The real point of progress monitoring is we're monitoring the effectiveness of the intervention. Okay. That's what we need to know about, is what we're doing working. Okay. So I really think I'd love to see that tweak for teachers. Sometimes, if the child is struggling, sometimes it means they need more intensity. They need more practice. They need more time practicing every day. Mm-hmm. Sometimes what it means is we're not using the right intervention. And that's what progress monitoring should really be teaching us. And that's, again, psychologists have a measurement background. They have skills around assessment and how we know what's going on. That's what they should bring to the table, I think. Definitely. And these recommendations, I think, really support that.
For sure. Well, and something that we've basically been talking about in this little portion has been making sure that evidence-based reading interventions are available. And that's when we're looking at recommendations 73 and 74 and making sure that the schools have the access to the interventions for each grade level, for each tier, and that they're available to all students who need them. So the students don't have to change schools to get the interventions that are needed. And that's huge. It's so important to be in your neighborhood community school and getting the support you need, because you have those established friendships and it keeps you in that home environment instead of having to commute and travel.
And there should be no need. Now, when I say there should be no need, again, I'm talking about down the road a little bit here too. Okay. Like one of the cautions that I have is I'm not sure if everybody is clearly aware of the massive endeavor that it's going to be to have all teachers, especially in those early grades, provided with the professional learning opportunity that they need. You can't go for a half a day in service and become an expert in reading. It just isn't possible. Having taught a lot of teachers about how reading is acquired and what, I can give an overview in a day that helps people to orient and situate to what they need to know. But then professional learning is an ongoing, like, okay, now you know this, here, let's take this one piece of it, phonemic awareness, for example. And I'll show you something that you can go and try and do with a few students. Come back to me next time. Let's talk about how that went. Let's talk about what you learned from it. Let's talk about the questions you have. Now you've tried to do some of that. So I guess we're getting into a little bit of next week's discussion, but we can kind of move back and forth, I guess. So yes, I think that yes, we need to have those, like this intervention for this kind of issue at this tier. That clarity of a structure and a framework is going to be great, but it's still going to need an awful lot of teacher training, teacher professional learning, for them to be able to go and implement those interventions. It's not a recipe card.
No, it's not. And, you know, I've been studying this stuff for years now. And I only know a fraction of what there is to know. And it's important to have that humbleness and realize that there is always more to learn. And
exactly.
What we know now is going to be different than what we know next year. And we need to keep up with the changes in the practice and how we can do things best for our students. We have already talked about removing those inappropriate eligibility requirements, which are looking at the recommendations 75 to 78. And one that I definitely want to highlight that I think is 78. Essential is number 78. I think we're reading each other's minds, and that is making sure that you do not exclude students because they have another diagnosis. So if a student has ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, or any other
factor, it doesn't even have to be a disability, right?
They still deserve and should be eligible for quality intervention.
Literacy instruction, yes.
Because reading and comprehending what you read is really the equalizer. And I have worked with students on the spectrum. I have worked with students with ADHD, and they can learn how to read.
Of course they can, yes.
And there's actually a very, very small percentage of the population that can't learn how to read. And typically, those are the ones that cannot comprehend spoken language.
Exactly. That when we have to have an oral language comes first. It really is a foundation for literacy, having the functional. And one of the things I think we should recognize is that saying that every child can learn to read with like once they've developed some, reasonable facility with oral language.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. And we should recognize that there's still a range of how well children will understand. What we can do is get kids to decode the words.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of times it's not just decoding that has been an issue. The language comprehension may be also interfering. And so what I like to say is we can teach kids to decode almost any, like if they, with enough practice and enough time, we can teach kids to decode words they know in their oral language. What we may struggle to do is have kids, like some kids can pronounce words more readily when, even if they've never heard that word before, because they've developed such a good understanding of patterns of English language and the letters and combinations of letters that most probably represent certain sounds. And they've got that good probabilistic understanding, so they can pronounce a word even if they've never heard it before. But that's not true for everybody. So when we say we can teach all kids to read, we do still recognize that there's a range of how well they will understand what they read. So if we're defining reading as reading comprehension, there's still a range in comprehension, even though we can do a good job with decoding.
Yeah, definitely. Well,
can I just say one more thing about 78?
Yes.
Steve Dykstra is a psychologist in Wisconsin, I believe, and you'll see him on some of the discussion groups and everything. And I watched a presentation that he did, and he was talking about the relationship between trauma and literacy.
Yeah.
And one, it really moved me powerfully because it's sort of something I kind of knew at one level, but couldn't explain as well as he did, which was that the most effective intervention we can give to a child who's either experiencing acute phases of trauma or the chronic after effects of trauma, that the best resiliency factor that we give to kids is literacy.
Yeah.
Okay. And like, that's what schools can do. And that's how we change the trajectory over generations is bibliotherapy, the ability to read, the ability to go outside of your own experience, the ability to relate to experiences that aren't native to your experience, the windows into other opportunities or other ways of being. That's a huge part of healing and growth for people. And so we don't say, oh, we have to deal with the emotional stuff first before we can learn. We say, no, learning to read is part of how students are going to learn to deal with the challenges and the barriers and the traumas that they've experienced in life. So because this one talked a little bit more, 78 talks a little bit about disability, but I wanted to kind of connect it to the broader need. We don't shut anybody out of literacy intervention because that's something else.
And the success that children feel when they learn how to read and it starts clicking, the smiles on their faces, the ways that their eyes lighten up and brighten, it's amazing.
It even just as you talk about it, because I've had some of those very powerful experiences, I get that slightly goosebumpy feeling. That because when you see, and I think of certain kids, especially that I've worked with, where I know that the work that we've done together, and I'm not saying it couldn't be done with anybody else, it just happened to be me at the time. The work that we've done together has changed their trajectory from somebody who thought they would never learn to read to someone who was convinced they not only could, but they were learning to read. And the difference that was going to make in their whole life long, that pathway of lifelong learning, it's beyond words, actually. I'm sure, and those of us who have gone through that journey with kids, we know how important it is that all schools, all teachers, all communities understand that we can do this, and it's got to be a priority.
Well, and it leads me to another Anita Archer quote, very simple: success breeds success.
Exactly.
Right? And they see what, this hard work and what they can get out of reading, it ignites that spark for learning. And I know there's, quotes out there about the literate illiterate, or, removing the joy from reading. And I don't think that's applicable.
I've never seen a child who couldn't read find it joyful. Okay. I've found, there are children who, that's not their biggest passion in life. But I think that we make a mistake if we think that our job is to make sure that some kids end up passionate about reading. That's a different goal for our schools than deciding that our job is to teach all kids to read and for it to be truly joyful. Okay. And there's lots of adults who are very contented and successful and happy, who don't spend a lot of time reading for enjoyment. That just isn't their big passion. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I love to read. So yes, I'd love to share that joy with others, but I can't do it if they can't read. So that's got to come first.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for this.
I know that there's all kinds of other recommendations that we could have talked about.
Well, hopefully we might be able to book some extra ones.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'll see you next week, and we can maybe move back and forth a little on the topics that we've, I can comment on a couple more recommendations about assessment next week, but we got more time.
Well, thank you so much. And listeners, this will be available as a podcast on the Right to Read Initiative podcast. You can watch it as a replay on the Right to Read Initiative website and YouTube channel. Make sure that you like and subscribe so we know that you're enjoying the content we're pushing out. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you so much, Kathryn.